Welcome back. Today we'll be looking at the Crusades. Understand that the Crusades, it's a long period of time. There are many Crusades that take shape outside of the ones from the Middle East. There are other Crusades within Europe. So this content, because it is an intro class, we're only looking at the tip of the iceberg. But I do want to address some major issues that kind of help develop this notion of otherness, particularly in the context of the medieval world that is now moving into places that they haven't been to before since the Roman Empire. So you could take an entire class on the Crusades, and maybe you'll might want to do that in future courses when you go to university. But at the very least, we do want to touch as to the ideology and also to see how this kind of creates conflict for future generations. And by future generations, I mean within the Middle Ages. For a long period of time, everybody kind of forgets about the Crusades, and then they come back with the Romantic era in the 19th century. So really want to kind of focus on this period alone. So these are the goals for today. We're going to look at the context of crusading. So where does crusading come from? Nothing comes out of a vacuum. There's reasons why they went on crusades. The textbook talks briefly about some of it, and we'll look at those in a little while. And we're going to really address this issue of church and state. We've been talking about the church and the state from the beginning of the semester, who has more power. And this is a clear example of how much authority the Catholic Church has in this medieval world. Understand that there are no other churches at this time. The Catholic Church is the only game in town. So if you're a Protestant or some other denomination of Christianity, your faith doesn't even exist yet, right? At least not in Western Europe. At Western Europe, there's only Catholicism. And in doing so, they create a uniform identity. Something that kind of unites all Europeans together, whether you're French, German, English, Italian, or Spanish. And then we'll look at specific events, and you'll do that on your own, looking at answering some questions that I'll pose, focusing on specific crusades and their importance during this particular period. So first, let's look at the background. So like I said earlier, nothing comes out of a vacuum. The Crusades are very much so religious conflicts, but they're also political conflicts. And not just political in the sense of conflicts between Muslims and Christians, but really conflicts within Europe. That plays a major role in causing people to go on crusades. The war itself is a lot of times just kind of the action, but the rhetoric sometimes becomes much more significant when it comes to crusading. So first, let's begin between addressing the relationship between Muslims and Christians. So if you can recall some of the reads that we've had in the past, even last week, it talks about La Reconquista with Spain. Well, prior to La Reconquista, you have Muslims moving into Spain, and this is very much so natural what's happening in Europe. People are conquering other people. Muslims were just another group conquering different territories. So they conquered Spain in the 700s, and that doesn't really cause any conflict because Muslims were pretty open to different people. They let Jewish people practice their faith. They let Christians practice their faith. And if you converted to Islam, you actually had to pay a lower tax rate. So for some people, it made economic sense to convert. Also, it's important to note that when Christians control some of this territory, they were pretty harsh on different groups of people, such as Jewish people. So sometimes certain groups welcomed the Muslims, and Islam in medieval Spain has a very fascinating history. And if you were alive any time during this period, probably the best place to be alive is medieval Spain. It's a very diverse region. It is a place of learning. Many kind of great scholars come to the region to learn. And a lot of the great innovations that happen in Europe isn't thanks to Muslims. So last week we covered Thomas Aquinas, who uses Aristotelian theory, right? Well, it's because of the Muslims preserving that knowledge is why we have the development of Thomas Aquinas and his existence of God. So Muslims play a very important role in the development of Europe during this period. But this time, they're living in Spain. They call it Al-Andalus. And it's, like I said, for a good solid, 400 years, 300 years, they to some extent coexisted. Obviously, there's always conflict because it's just medieval Europe at this time. But for the most part, they coexisted. But by the High Middle Ages, as you can see, 1063, you begin to see this notion of difference. So at one time they got along. A great example of this is El Cid. If you've ever heard of El Cid, he's a Spanish Christian guy who was a mercenary. He fought for whoever paid him the most. He fought for Muslims, he fought for Christians. And, so it kind of indicates that there was coexistence in Spain. But by 1063, identities begin to really take shape in Europe. And we find that the Pope begins to support those who attack Muslims. And we begin to see this kind of anti-Muslim rhetoric emerge around this time. People like St. James, gets who has a shrine in Compostela. That's something that was covered last week. Some of these pilgrimages of the Middle Ages. He was known as El Matamoros. Those of you that speak Spanish, Matamoros means to kill Muslims. Other parts of Europe are going through that same process where they're, again, having conflicts with Muslim people. And another place where we see these kind of conflicts emerge are places like Sicily. Again, the Catholic Church is trying to create the sense of uniform identity that's based not on region, but rather faith. So they encourage different people to go and conquer non-Christian territory, whether it be Eastern Europe or part of some parts of Europe. So Sicily, if you know the history of Sicily, they've been conquered over and over throughout generations. This is just another example of the Pope encouraging Normans to go in there and take over the island. And Christians eventually do take over that place. Another important part of this background is the second son. So if you can remember when we talked about the history of marriage, where the firstborn gets everything and the second son gets disinherited, second, third, fourth son, right? They get nothing. Well, they have very limited opportunities because they're not going to be kings, they're not going to be nobles, so they have to go out and seek their own opportunities. So the Crusades create this opportunity that they would have never had otherwise. So the second son, again, second, third, fourth, those kids that are disinherited get the opportunity to go use their skills of warfare and go fight in non-Christian territory. Here we're talking about the Middle East. So the church, quite early on, right at the during the High Middle Ages, create this notion of warfare, right? Obviously, if you're a Christian, you're not supposed to kill, but the Catholic Church introduces these concepts of warfare, where it's okay to kill under certain conditions. So they create the Truce of God, which basically limits warfare in Europe. I think it's like 40 days. But for the most part, you're not supposed to fight for a certain period of time. And this is the church implementing its will onto the Christian people. So again, it shows the authority of the Catholic Church. Another important document is the peace of God, where the church says, well, it's okay to fight and to engage in warfare, but under certain conditions. Number one, it had to be a just cause. Well, who defines a just cause? Well, at this time, it's the Catholic Church, all right? They see themselves as the authority, so they're the ones who are promoting when is a good time to go to war and when it's not. Another element, is that the war must be fought in a just way. So you can't just go around ransacking people, because that's what many of these knights did. They went on these events just to go, loot and kill people, because they need to make a living somehow, right? So the Catholic Church was arguing that you cannot just go and start killing innocent people, particularly those who are defenseless. So that includes women, that includes children, but that also includes men who are not part of the military. So the church is trying to implement these concepts, and they relatively succeed here and there. All this still kind of takes, still happens regardless of what the church indicates. But then the last point is that when it comes to warfare, that it must be declared by a just authority. And again, because the Catholic Church sees itself as the ultimate authority in medieval Europe, they feel like they're the only ones who have the right to call upon people to go to war. I'll try to post some videos that are from documentaries that kind of address these type of topics, and just to kind of reaffirm the things that I'm presenting here. Another important element, more of this background, is that Jerusalem becomes a very important place of pilgrimage. So last week we talked about that, right? Again, how the Catholic Church has these different aspects of their faith that become important to many Christians. And one of them is going on pilgrimage. And by the year 1000, this becomes a very important place to go to pilgrimage to, right? So over here in Jerusalem, we have other places such as Rome. I don't know why it has it pointed up there, it's too high, but it should be down here, right? The Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage over here in Spain become very important sites. And the church wants to give access to these places so people can go and practice their faith. Around the year 1000, though, this route to Jerusalem gets pretty much closed off because the Egyptian ruler controls all this territory. So, but again, look at the year, right? 1009. It's pretty much closed to many Christians. But the Catholic Church still finds it a very important place to go. Again, that's the place of Jesus's birth, right? The region, at least, and they feel that Christians should be able to go. Another important background element is that the Catholic Church wants to connect the Catholic Church with the Eastern Orthodox Church. For many generations, they have been going through conflicts. Not all Christianity is the same. Western Europe is pretty much defined by Catholicism. Eastern Europe is defined by Eastern Orthodox. And the Catholic Church sees this as a good opportunity to go and merge these two faiths as one. So again, that's that kind of political, that the church has an incentive to call this crusade, and it might help them out. So the Catholic Church is proposing this idea that this would be good, right? A war would be good, really, for them. This could help out. This can help out the Catholic Church bring these two groups together, because in 1054 they did have a meeting with the Eastern Orthodox, and it just completely collapsed. It's a complete mess. But the Church felt that maybe a crusade can help address these conflicts. All right. Let's continue looking at the Crusades. So we talked about the social, we talked about the political, and now we're going to address the economical. So like any conflict in history, right, there are social aspects, there's political rhetoric, but But then there's also economic aspects to it too, right? And we could think to some of our most recent wars to look at the interest that we might have in order to go and to help justify going to war, right? So the Crusades are no different from that. We find that the Mediterranean, going back to early history, is a very important region. But once Rome collapses, it still thrives. We still see a lot of economic commerce happening in the Mediterranean. So we see a lot of trading happening between the East and the West, particularly in places like Italy and Greece and Jerusalem and Egypt. And part of this has to do just because people need to work and make money, but we also find that in Jerusalem, which is controlled by Islamic people, we find that Islam is very much so a trading religion. So Muhammad himself was a trader, right? He used to trade for a living. So Islam kind of has elements of that, not complete elements, but there is an element of that where trading becomes an important part of the culture, but also it's connected to the faith too. So commerce is a very important aspect of the region. But then again, people are just trading because they need to, they have a taste for different goods. So this region, places like the Holy Land, places like Jerusalem, are very important because they are at the center of the East and the West, right? They are almost in the middle of bringing goods from the East into the West. A great example of that are things like paper, right? It's the Muslims who introduced paper to Europe. And, paper actually comes from China. So it's Islamic traders who bring it from China into their region, and then it kind of flows to other parts of Europe. So this region was very important economically. And then lastly, we find that this region also offers economic opportunities. The video that I'll show you in a minute kind of reaffirms that point, where those disinherited sons of the nobility will not get land in Europe, right? All that land is essentially being divvied up amongst the firstborn, the whole concept of primogeniture. Well, now the East becomes a place where many of these can go, take over territory, and become nobles in some of these regions. So, the second son, and I'll talk about this in the next lesson when we look at business, but the second son become the front runners to what we will define as the bourgeois. Many of these people who are, the disinherited children, are disinherited in land and title, but many of them do get money. So they have economic means to develop a trade and become part of this new entrepreneur class. Like I said, this subject could be an entire semester, and I actually took a Crusades class back when I was a college student, such as yourself. So there's just so much to cover. And like I said, it's about 9 Crusades plus other non-official Crusades. And you have La Reconquista to add to that. So yeah, there's a lot of material there if you're interested in exploring the Crusades as a subject. But since we're in an intro class, we just want to highlight some major points and look at its impact that it's had in our history. I will put a link to a video because it's important to note that once these events actually took place, most people forgot about it. And it's not until the 19th century where people are reintroducing this material all over again. And they're introducing it in a way that kind of distorts the history of the Crusades. Again, this is that romantic era of the 19th century that is trying to envision itself in light of what has happened in the past, trying to show a continuous story when in reality there's really no connection there. And we're guilty of it too, right now with the recent pandemic with the whole COVID-19, all of a sudden people started getting interested in the Black Death, right? Everybody essentially forgot about the Black Death, and all of a sudden it becomes very important. And the same thing happens with the Crusades. People forget about it, and then something happens that awakens society about these subjects, but then they try to tie it into who we are today, these historical events, and that makes it very problematic. So there's certain times that we can make those connections, there's certain times that we can't, and here we see where the Crusades does have a major impact on Europe. Number one, it even though they lose, right? The only successful crusade was the first one. It does benefit Europe in many ways. I guess in the kind of trickle down theory, it benefits Europe, but it absolutely benefits the Italian states, cities like Venice, Genoa. All these kind of port cities begin to benefit directly from the economic trade with the Middle East. Places like Venice are avenues towards the rest of Europe. So these cities become very important after not even after, but even during the Crusades. So these become very significant communities that will give birth to the Renaissance. Second, we have the introduction of Eastern goods into the European market, right? So it's not quite there, but this is the beginning of a global economy where Europe gets a taste of these goods and now they want them. And this will kind of give birth to much more exploration to other parts of the world. Europeans gain a lot of information about traveling because of Muslims. And this will open up the Atlantic to Europeans to come over to the Americas and extract many resources from places like Latin America and the United States. Another important aspect in regards to the significance of the Crusades is that it really increases the authority of the Catholic Church. As mentioned earlier, it's the Catholic Church who calls the Crusades on different groups of people. It begins with Spain, that is almost like the testing ground to attack Muslims. But then it continues this attack on other people who they feel are not like them. So not so much just Muslims, but if you can remember last week's material, the Cathars, that group of religious Christians who did not follow Catholicism, who thought the Catholic Church was corrupt and evil by its very nature. The Catholic Church calls a crusade on them. And then it also gives birth to the Inquisition. Again, those people who do not adhere to Christian values and Christian beliefs become a target of the Catholic Church and the states that support them. So it really shows how the Catholic Church increases in its authority during this period. During the 12th century, the Catholic Church is very much so at its height when it comes to power. We mentioned this a few times, but Europe, it allows Europe to get rid of a lot of troubled knights that are just vagabonding around Europe, right? That are causing chaos, that are attacking other Christians, that are attacking the poor, which is why the Church institutes the truths of God and I can't remember the other document, but those documents that we talked about, the peace of God, right? Those documents that we talk where the Church indicates who you can fight with and so forth. So the Crusades were helpful in kind of ridding itself of a lot of people to go fight, because the Church essentially says, if you want to fight, go fight these people. But in doing so, you have this kind of growth of animosity towards people who are different, particularly people who are non-Christians. So I mentioned earlier that in places like Spain, Muslims tend to tolerate, for the most part, different faiths, right? Again, Jewish and Christian being the other dominant groups in these regions. But as Christians begin to get the upper hand in places like Spain and different regions, they become more intolerant of these different people, right? So if the Crusades did anything, it created this sense of an us versus them type of mentality. this concept that, we might be French, we might be, English, German, and so forth, but at the end, one thing that ties us all together is the sense of Christian faith. So many scholars have noted that it creates this identity of the other, right? Jewish people and Muslim people become scapegoats. They become, at least in the eyes of many Christians, the problem. And as you saw in the readings, right, Jewish people had nothing to do with any of these fights, yet they're the ones who begin to be attacked in places like Germany. So the Crusades does help create this kind of concepts of an us versus them. And we see this examples in different places, not only during the Crusades, but even after the Crusades, where in England they begin to expel the Jewish population. In France, they do the same thing, because these people are seen as a threat to European identity. And those that didn't get expelled or even killed are forced to convert. In places like Spain, you had two options. You can leave or you can convert, right? And if you didn't convert, they have the right to kill you. So we see how the Crusades helps create the sense of a Christian identity.